I'm going to be ranking the rivalries and derbies in the A-League from 7 to 1. That's right, apparently there's 7. I originally had 6 by memory, and there was a 7th on Wikipedia, and funnily enough, I actually put it above one of the ones that I remembered. So, you'll see which one that is when we get to it, but we'll start with number 7, which I've got as the Distance Derby. I think having the Distance Derby in our league is really cool. It's the longest away trip in a domestic top flight competition. 5,225 kilometers separate the teams, but it's not really a rivalry. Like, there is obviously, like, good games between the two teams, and maybe the supporters of each of those teams want to win the matches more, but it's literally going away next year because Auckland are coming in, and they're going to be further away from Perth than Wellington are, so yeah, it's going away. They've also had like one finals game in the last 5 years against each other, and that was during COVID, so it wasn't really a big game. And yeah, I just think that while it's cool having the Distance Derby, it's not a real rivalry. It's obviously not a real derby, and it goes in at number 7. Then, at number 6, we've got the Westgate Derby / the Battle of the Bridge. And if you don't know what that is, it's because it's Melbourne Victory versus Western United. And it's only on this list because of Wikipedia. This is the one that I forgot about, but I figured I'd throw it on just to expand the list a bit. But yeah, this is only above the Distance Derby, and that's because it is a proper derby. I mean, there are two teams from the same city in a way involved in this match, and the Wikipedia little thing on it mentions the comebacks, mentions Melbourne Victory beating Western United 6-1, but for me, these guys have had a short history. I've watched the entire history of this derby, and the biggest moment for me is the 4-1 second leg semi-final, which put Western through to the grand final that they won. And I rewatched the highlights of that going into this video, and wow, what a game. I mean, Western United, first of all, had a phenomenal squad, but it was a massive Melbourne Victory turnout. Western United had a packed corner away bay, and yeah, it just looked like scenes when they won. So there's obviously a bit of history here, but for me, it's not very iconic. The atmosphere isn't very big consistently, and I don't think Melbourne Victory would consider Western United rivals in much of a sense, especially in comparison to the other kind of derbies and stuff that are on this list. I don't think Western United would be considered in the same way. So yeah, the Westgate Derby is at number 6. Then at number 5, we've got the F3 Derby. They played in the grand final once, Newcastle and Central Coast Mariners, and it was actually the only grand final that failed to sell out until Melbourne City hosted one. So that's interesting, but they played in 2008. Newcastle won the grand final, and aside from that, their rivalry is based off proximity, but they're not from the same city, so I guess it isn't really a derby. I think that's the consensus amongst football fans, is a derby is two teams from the same city, but it's still allowed to be called that, whatever. And they play for a chunk of concrete. There's semi-decent away turnouts, especially from Newcastle. And yeah, I don't think this is the most heated rivalry in the A-League. I don't think it's the most respected by fans, but there's definitely consistency amongst Newcastle and Mariners fans that there is hatred there. And yeah, I've got it in above the Westgate Derby and the Distance Derby. I do think it's cool. It's a game that I've never been to, and definitely a game I'd like to go to, but yeah, it's definitely not one of the top 4 iconic rivalries in the A-League. One that is the Melbourne Derby between Victory and Melbourne City. it's usually a massive game. It's got attendances that can sometimes compete with the Sydney Derby. They've had semi-finals in both the league and the cup in the last 10 years. I think they've sold out Marvel for one of those, which is like a 50,000 attendance. There's consistently two active supports on either end. You've obviously got the North End for Melbourne Victory and the City Terrace for Melbourne City. Melbourne City's numbers are usually a bit poorer than Melbourne Victory's, but they do bring decent turnouts quite often to derbies. So yeah, that makes it quite big. And then you've got what happens on the field as well. You've obviously got the Tom Glover incident recently where he lobbed a flare into the Melbourne Victory end. Bruno Fallen-Roley switching from City to Perth, then to Victory is pretty controversial. Melbourne City have obviously had massive dominance recently. They won a derby 7-0 a couple of years ago, and before that they won a derby 6-0. Melbourne Victory have had their fair share of big derby wins, and overall this is just one of the iconic games in the A-League. If you want to see a good atmosphere, if you want to see a good match, if you want to see drama, the Melbourne Derby usually has all of those things, and for me, it's put in at number 4. The ones above it also have those things, but I just think they're older, and I just think they have a little bit more about them. But the Melbourne Derby is obviously massive, and I've got it in at number 4. Then at number 3, it's the original rivalry. I've got it mainly in above the Melbourne Derby because it's old, and also because there's been 3 grand finals, I think, played out between these sides. It's also an intercity rivalry, which I do rate. They're hard to develop, and I feel like this is one of the natural and consistent intercity rivalries that we see. Obviously, Melbourne and Adelaide have the closest proximity, I think, out of any interstate Australian cities. Obviously, Newcastle and Sydney, or even Canberra and Sydney would be closer, but as far as interstate goes, Melbourne and Adelaide are probably the closest, and I think it's bred a great rivalry that's just always going to be iconic in the A-League. Amy Park usually gets good away turnouts from Adelaide and good home turnouts from Melbourne Victory, and the same is true with Cooper Stadium, usually huge turnouts from Melbourne Victory and great turnouts from Adelaide. The games, always iconic. I've missed the most iconic ones because they were, grand finals early on in the A-League era of football in Australia. But one of the most iconic ones I can remember recently is, I think, a preliminary final where Bessart Berisha just absolutely munted Adelaide, and I think he scored a bicycle kick. But yeah, there's been plenty of games where it's been heated and it's been awesome. There's also racial and homophobic abuse from one side, which, shouldn't be in football, but it does intensify the rivalry a bit as well. So, for me, the original rivalry goes in at number 3. Then, at number 2, we've got the Big Blue, because it's the 2 most successful clubs in Australia. They've played 63 games against each other, and it's still quite difficult to separate the two. I think Sydney FC have won more regular season games, Victory have won more non-grand finals games, and Sydney FC have won more finals games. And we haven't met Melbourne Victory in any other competition other than the A-League, so we're still waiting on a cup fixture. Maybe we'll meet them in an AFC Cup game or something like that. But everything about this game is massive. I mean, the ones that I can think of at the moment: 3-2 in 17-18, 6-1 in 18-19. The grand finals, 2010 looked mental, and there was also a battle for the Premier's Plate that season where Sydney FC, I believe, won on the last day. We've had countless Australia Day games that I'm sure are iconic, and that's just from a Sydney FC. I mean, the 3-2 for Melbourne Victory I chucked in there for them, but I'm sure there's more iconic moments for Melbourne Victory fans as well, like the 2015 grand final. It has everything: great atmosphere, massive attendance, drama on the pitch as well. I actually looked at players that had swapped between the two clubs, and prior to 2016, there had only been 3 players to swap between the two in 11 years. Now there's 10, but that's all happened quite recently. And the ones that come to mind for me are obviously Costa Barbarouses, that was a big deal. Antonis, big deal. Seb Ryle, big deal. Vukovic, big deal. Mitch Austin, not a big deal. Cam Sober, Melbourne Victory fans were happy to get rid of him, but he was good for Sydney FC. Josh Brillante, same kind of thing. You know, he's a bit of a joke of a player, but Melbourne Victory seemed happy to sign him, and they maybe even won a cup with him there as their captain. So maybe it was worth signing a fucking trader. And yeah, James Donachie as well was another one that had swapped recently, although yeah, it kind of burns off. But there's some massive kind of swaps there that were a big deal, especially when they happened. And yeah, that just intensifies the rivalry even more. And yeah, that's about it. I mean, it's just one of the most massive games in the A-League. It's genuine, it's intercity, it's based off competitiveness and hatred. And yeah, I think the Big Blue goes in at number 2. What's it called? Honourable mentions, because we've obviously thrown in the Distance Derby and the Westgate Derby. For me, they're rivalries for sure, but they're not the big rivalries in the A-League. And here's some that I think could have been thrown in the list kind of on par with them. It's actually only like, I'll see if I can come up with 3. I came up with 2 so far, and it was Sydney FC versus the Mariners, because everyone hates the Mariners. And, you know, we always have good turnouts there. It's always important for us to beat the Mariners. We've played them in a grand final. We've recently played them 3 times a row in a row in the Cup. And, yeah, I mean, it's definitely not up there with the Big Blue, but I think it's definitely comparable to like the Distance Derby or something like that. Same with Melbourne City versus Adelaide. I mean, it is just an original rivalry light, but I feel like there is just a bit of rivalry going on between Melbourne City and Adelaide, especially when you consider the fact that Victory have been a bit shit recently. Melbourne have stepped up and kind of been the team that's quite competitive with Adelaide. Obviously, they've been winning a lot more, but they've had some big games, and I think they even played, was it Melbourne City who were on the end of a 4-0 defeat at Cooper's in the Cup final a couple of years ago? Because I think they were, and yeah, they've just played recently, and I think it could be considered a big rivalry. And then if I were to throw another one in just to see what I could come up with, Sydney MacArthur, Sydney Brisbane, they're all fucking Sydney perspective ones. Let me know another kind of like half-assed A-League derby. I mean, Melbourne City, Western United could be there, shit like that. But yeah, number 1, the awful honourable mention section, but number 1 is the Sydney Derby because it is the biggest. Like, as a Sydney fan, I have more hatred for Melbourne Victory, but the Sydney Derby is the biggest. I mean, it's been on fucking Copper 90 on that Derby show they do. That makes it officially bigger than any other derby in the A-League. There's 2 sets of actives always. Like, I mean, I know there's been some dwindling numbers over COVID and the Westie scum being shit. Like, that's seen their attendances drop, but there's always been some semblance of RBB. We've had big knockout games. Obviously, the Cup semi-final a couple of years ago, which we won 3-0, and the A-League semi-final last season, which we won 2-1. Sydney FC have a massive trophy count. It's just massively in favor of us. But Western Sydney obviously have the AFC Champions League trophy count, so there'll always be that kind of argument there, or at least until Sydney win a Champions League or Western Sydney win, 5 leagues, 4 Premiers plates, and a couple of FA Cups. Yeah, like, I mean, there's a differential in trophies that I think either side can kind of argue for. Personally, I take Sydney's trophy count over a single big trophy 10 years ago, but to each their own. And it's also, I mean, a lot of people say it's the biggest rivalry in Australian sport. I think it's very hard to come by how massive Origin is, but it certainly is the biggest single city rivalry in Australian sport. Like, AFL will have good attendances for their intercity matches, but that's not because of it. Like, they just get big attendances anyway. Whereas, you know, people turn out for the Sydney Derby. It's 2 sides of a city. There's a genuine divide there, and there's hatred across it. And you know what? Having lived in Sydney all my life, I think hatred of West Sydney is quite fair. The people that live there are fucking animals. Also, you've got the benefit of 2 new home stadiums for both sides. I'm sure a lot of people would have loved for it just to remain at the old SFS and Parramatta, but those stadiums have been upgraded, and now we get to see the rivalry develop at those grounds for the next 20 or 30 years, which is quite exciting. Obviously, there's been player crossover as well. Recently, you've had Milos Ninkovic and Vedran Janjetovic go to Western Sydney, which brought out a lot of hate from Sydney FC fans. And on the other side, you've got Bomi Johan and Andrew Redmayne and more that have, like, and there's plenty more than that. Like, there was quite a few inaugural Wanderers players that came from Sydney FC. You've obviously got Tony Popovic, who played for Sydney FC, Mark Rudin, who played for Sydney FC before he was a massive fucking creep, and all of that. But yeah, you've just got player crossover, and there's always drama around that. You've also got TIFOs, you've got no TIFOs, and you've got stolen TIFOs. Like, there's just always something going on. There's always TIFO drama around the derby, and it's good because it breeds some sick footballing art and on both sides. And yeah, I think that just makes the derby more tense, and you know, it's another way for fans and, you know, in turn the areas of the city to compete with each other about who's bigger, who's better, and all that. And the other thing that I think adds to this, that it doesn't really with the Melbourne Derby, is that this derby formed or came about after expansion, and I feel like that kind of creates a bit of a divide because, you know, Western Sydney came in and they just went chalk, like, you know, we represent West Sydney now. People obviously bought into that idea massively, and that's part of how the derby was formed, right? Is that it cut off a lot of Sydney FC's fan base and potential fan base. It left people out in West Sydney who you know, all of a sudden would cop shit for not supporting West Sydney despite supporting Sydney FC before then. And yeah, I think that just intensifies the rivalry as well. But for me, the Sydney Derby just has so many things going for it. I mean, the top 4 are interchangeable for me, depending on, you know, what team you're passionate about and how you see those games. And also, they'll just change over time as well. So yeah, feel free to let me know your rankings of the 7 I've added, and if there's any I've missed, let me know. But yeah, those are my derby rankings. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it's just a fun talking point, and I'm going to head out of here because I got shit to do. So thank you very much for watching, and see you.